She was just a quiet black girl in a public high school science fair, ignored, mocked, and humiliated by her own teacher. In front of the whole class, the teacher kicked her out of the fair, calling her invention a joke. But what no one knew, NASA was already running simulations on her idea. And when the truth came out, jaws dropped, careers ended, and a teenage genius became a national name. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from, and if this story is already hitting home, make sure you hit that like button. The air in the gymnasium buzzed with a nervous energy, a mix of teenage excitement and the low hum of fluorescent lights. It was the day of the Northwood High annual science fair. Tables draped in white cloths lined the basketball court, each one a small kingdom of ambition. Volcanoes made of papier-mâché sat next to charts about plant photosynthesis. A trio of boys in matching polo shirts showed off a potato-powered clock. Parents peeked in from the double doors, their faces a mixture of pride and curiosity, while a handful of local judges in serious-looking suits roamed the aisles, clipboards in hand. At a small table near the back, away from the more flashy displays, Imani Carter carefully arranged her project. It wasn't flashy, it didn't bubble or glow. It was a compact, 3D printed device, matte black and intricate, with a few ports on the side for wires. A neatly printed label read, Atmospheric Energy Harvester, Gen 2. She straightened the label, her hands steady, her focus absolute. She wasn't here for the prize money or the extra credit. She was here for the science. She felt a presence loom over her table and looked up. It was Mr. Charles Dunning, the head of the science department. He was a man in his mid-50s who carried himself with an air of permanent disappointment, as if the world had consistently failed to meet his standards. He strolled by her table, gave her project a passing glance, and let out a short, sharp scoff, a sound like air leaking from a tire. Then he stopped. He backtracked, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. His eyes, small and critical behind his glasses, narrowed into slits. He pointed a thick finger at her device. "This?" he asked, his voice unnecessarily loud, drawing the attention of students at nearby tables. "This is your project." Imani felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she kept her expression calm. She gave a small, respectful nod. "Yes, Mr. Dunning." He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her entire display. He didn't look at the detailed schematics she had laid out or the notebook filled with her meticulous calculations. He only looked at the device itself, a look of profound disbelief on his face. "You expect us to believe a high schooler made this?" His voice grew louder, more performative. A few students who had been chatting with their friends now turned to watch. A judge paused his assessment of a project on mold growth. "You just bought this online, didn't you? Admit it." Imani's voice was quiet but firm. "I made it, sir. I have the build logs and the research data right here." She gestured to her notebook. He waved a dismissive hand, not even glancing at it. The idea that she could have produced something so sophisticated was, to him, an impossibility. It broke the rules of his world, where students were categorized and filed away based on his preconceived notions. And Imani Carter did not fit his mold of a young inventor. "Don't lie to me, Carter," he snapped. His face was turning a blotchy red. He was enjoying the attention, the feeling of authority. He turned to the wider audience, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "We have a cheater here. Someone who thinks they can pass off some mail-order gadget as their own work. This is fake science." The words echoed in the suddenly quiet gym. Students stared, their expressions ranging from shock to mild amusement. No one defended her. No one spoke up. They were just teenagers, caught in the uncomfortable spotlight of a teacher's public tirade. "I am not tolerating cheaters in my science fair," Dunning declared, his voice ringing with self-righteousness. He pointed toward the exit. "Get it out of here. Now. You're disqualified." The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on Imani. Her cheeks burned. She could feel dozens of eyes on her. A pair of popular girls near the front whispered behind their hands, and let out a sharp laugh. It cut through the silence, sharper than any of Dunning's words. Other students just looked down at their own projects, suddenly intensely interested in their tri-fold posters, refusing to meet her gaze. The silence from them was its own kind of condemnation. Imani didn't argue. She didn't cry. She held Miss Dunning's gaze for a single long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to infuriate him even more, she began to pack up. She carefully disconnected the small wires, placed the atmospheric energy harvester back into its protective case, and gathered her notebooks. She moved as if she were in a bubble, the sounds of the gym fading into a dull roar. Holding her project close to her chest, she started the long walk toward the exit. Each step felt like a mile. She could feel the stairs on her back. Across the gym, a sophomore named Liam Brooks watched the entire scene unfold, his mouth slightly open. He was in the AV club, a quiet kid who preferred observing to participating. He knew Imani, but not well. She was the girl who sat in the back of his chemistry class, never raised her hand, but always scored at the top of every test. The girl who never talked much. The girl who had just been publicly shamed for something he suspected was not a lie. He saw the flicker of cruel satisfaction on Mr. Dunning's face as Imani disappeared through the door, and he saw the uncomfortable shifting of the other students, who now quickly went back to their own conversations, eager to forget what they had just witnessed. Liam felt a knot of anger in his gut. This was wrong. Utterly and completely wrong. And nobody was doing a thing about it. The principal's office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Mr. Dunning had stormed in first, his face still flushed with a sense of righteous victory. He stood before Principal Thompson's desk, launching into a tirade before the man could even get a word in. "It was a blatant case of academic dishonesty, Richard," Dunning said, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "She brought in a professionally manufactured device and tried to pass it off as a school project. A toy, really. A complete fraud." Imani sat in a chair against the wall, perfectly still. She held the case containing her invention on her lap, her fingers resting lightly on the lid. She didn't look at Dunning. She didn't look at the principal. She just stared at a fixed point on the patterned carpet, her breathing slow and even. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, silence was her only shield. Any defense she offered would be twisted, used against her as evidence of insubordination or arrogance. Principal Thompson, a man whose primary leadership strategy was to avoid conflict at all costs, looked deeply uncomfortable. He fiddled with a pen on his desk, his gaze shifting between the furious teacher and the silent student. "Now, Charles," he began, his voice placating, "are we absolutely sure about this? Imani is a good student, straight A's in all her science classes." Dunning scoffed, a dismissive, ugly sound. "Exactly. Her grades are probably fake too. She's quiet, you see. They fly under the radar. But I saw through it. I saw through it the second I laid eyes on that thing." He gestured wildly toward the case on Imani's lap. "It's a toy. There's no way she built it. She probably got her brother to put it together, or her father. Who knows?" The mention of her father was a needle-sharp sting. He had been an electrician, a man who could coax life back into any broken thing. He had taught her how to solder, how to read a schematic, how to respect the quiet power of a current. He had passed away 2 years ago, and his workshop was now her sanctuary. Miss Dunning's casual, dismissive assumption was a desecration of that memory. Still, Imani said nothing. Her grip tightened on the case, her knuckles turning white. That was the only sign of the storm raging inside her. The principal sighed, clearly out of his depth. He looked at Imani, then back at Dunning, who stood there with his arms crossed, radiating an unshakable certainty. In the end, Principal Thompson chose the path of least resistance. He sided with the teacher. "Imani," he said, his tone one of weary regret. "Given Miss Dunning's position as head of the science department, I have to take his assessment seriously. You'll be disqualified from the competition pending a full review. We'll need to confiscate the project for examination." Imani finally looked up. Her eyes met the principal's, and for a moment, he saw a depth of disappointment that made him squirm in his chair. But the moment passed. She stood, placed the case on his desk without a word, and turned to leave. Her compliance seemed to embolden Dunning even further. As she reached the door, he stepped forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, venomous mutter, just loud enough for her to hear. "Stick to what you people are good at." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It wasn't just an insult about her project anymore. It was about her race. About her place in his narrow, bitter world. Imani froze for a fraction of a second, her hand on the doorknob. But she didn't turn around. She simply opened the door and walked out, her back straight, her head held high. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But she wasn't the only one who had heard it. Liam Brooks had followed her from the gym, compelled by a sense of injustice he couldn't shake. He had been standing just outside the principal's office, pretending to look at a bulletin board, the door slightly ajar. He heard every word. He heard the accusation of fraud. He heard the principal's weak surrender. And he heard Dunning's final hateful whisper. That was it. That was the moment everything shifted for Liam. The casual cruelty, the quiet poison of that last sentence. It was a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It wasn't just a teacher being a jerk anymore. It was something far uglier. He watched Imani walk down the empty hallway, her steps measured and controlled. He saw the rigid set of her shoulders. This wasn't just about a science fair. This was about dignity. And Liam Brooks, the quiet kid from the AV club, decided then and there that he couldn't stay quiet any longer. Someone had to step in. The world inside Imani's bedroom was a universe away from the sterile hallways of Northwood High. There were no posters of pop stars or piles of fashion magazines. Instead, the walls were lined with shelves holding not just books, but old circuit boards, spools of copper wire, and salvaged components from discarded electronics. Her desk wasn't cluttered with makeup. It was a dedicated workstation, complete with a soldering iron, a multimeter, and jars of carefully sorted resistors and capacitors. At the center of it all was a large corkboard covered in a web of papers, hand-drawn schematics, complex equations, and printouts of atmospheric pressure charts. This was her sanctuary. This was where the real work happened. Her invention, the one Mr. Dunning had dismissed as a toy, was the culmination of 3 years of relentless effort. It had started as a simple thought experiment after her father, an electrician with a curious mind, had told her stories about the static electricity that could build up in the atmosphere, sometimes powerful enough to interfere with radio signals. There's energy everywhere, Imani, he'd said, tapping his temple. You just have to be smart enough to grab it. After he passed away, his words became a mission. She inherited his small workshop in the garage, a space filled with the smell of ozone and old metal. His tools became an extension of her own hands. She spent countless hours there, surrounded by his legacy, teaching herself advanced physics and electrical engineering through open-source university lectures she found online. She took apart old radios, broken televisions, anything she could find, studying their inner workings, harvesting their parts. The first prototype of the atmospheric energy harvester, Gen 1, had been a clumsy, sprawling thing of wires and exposed circuit boards that barely managed to generate enough electricity to make an LED flicker. But it was a start. She refined it, redesigned it, made it more efficient, more compact. Gen 2, the device she'd brought to the science fair, was the result of 1,000 failures and one breakthrough. It used a series of specialized graphene-coated antennae to attract and capture ambient static electricity from the air, channeling it into a hyper-efficient capacitor bank, where it was converted into a stable, usable microcharge. It wasn't a toy, it was a potential revolution in a box. In theory, a larger version could power remote sensor arrays, off-grid homes, or even entire villages in developing countries where traditional power infrastructure was impossible. It could change the world's relationship with energy. But Imani wasn't thinking about changing the world. She was focused on the science, on solving the puzzle. The work was the reward. Months ago, on a whim, after a particularly successful test run in her backyard during a dry, windy evening, she had written up a preliminary concept paper. It was just a 2-page summary of her theory and early data. She'd found an online portal for a national STEM challenge for young innovators, a program sponsored by a handful of tech companies and government agencies. One of those agencies was NASA. She submitted it under the project title, Atmospheric Electrical Potential, using a generic email address, and then promptly forgot about it, diving back into her work. A few weeks later, an email appeared in her inbox. It was from the NASA Youth Technology Division. The message was brief and professional. It stated that her concept paper had been flagged for its novelty and potential. They were intrigued. They requested full specifications, schematics, and any prototype data she had. A link was provided to a secure upload portal. For a moment Imani had been stunned. NASA. The name itself felt monumental. But fear quickly followed the excitement. This was bigger than she had ever intended. She didn't want the attention. She didn't want to be in the spotlight. She just wanted to build. So she never replied. She saved the email, a secret validation of her work, and told no one. Not her mother, not her friends, not a single teacher at school. She was afraid that telling people would invite the very kind of judgment and disbelief she had faced from Mr. Dunning today. She had been right. Mr. Charles Dunning's bitterness was a slow-acting poison he had been sipping for 2 decades. He wasn't always a high school science teacher. He had once been a man with aspirations. In his younger days, he was a promising researcher at a mid-tier tech firm, working on a new type of data compression algorithm. He was convinced it was his ticket to fame and fortune, the patent that would make his name. He poured years of his life into it, working late nights, sacrificing relationships, his ego swelling with each small step forward. Then came the day of his final presentation to the board. He had stood before them, confident and proud, only to be told that a rival team at a much larger corporation had filed a patent for a nearly identical and superior technology just 3 weeks prior. His work was worthless. His dreams evaporated under the cold, fluorescent lights of that conference room. The tech firm let him go a few months later during a corporate restructuring. With a mortgage to pay and no other prospects in the competitive tech world, he had fallen back on his science degree and taken the only job he could get, teaching teenagers at an underfunded public high school. The job was a daily reminder of his failure. The eager, hopeful faces of his students were a mirror reflecting his own lost potential. Over the years, that disappointment curdled into a deep-seated resentment. He ruled his classroom like a petty tyrant, his grade book a ledger of perceived slights and personal bias. He loved order, discipline, and students who followed the rules without question. He despised disruption, originality, and anyone who dared to challenge his intellectual authority. In the teacher's lounge, a grim, windowless room that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee, his true nature would surface. He would sit at the corner table, nursing a mug, and hold court with a few other jaded instructors. You can't expect much from them, he'd say, stirring his coffee with a plastic spoon. Half of them can't even spell hypothesis, and now they think they're inventors? He reserved a special kind of disdain for students like Ahmad, students from backgrounds he didn't understand, students who possessed a quiet brilliance that he couldn't control or take credit for. Especially black kids who dared to be brilliant. Their success felt like a personal affront, a contradiction to his carefully constructed worldview where he remained the smartest person in any room he occupied. I saw that Carter girl's project today, he'd mentioned to Mrs. Gable, a history teacher, just the week before the fair when Imani had submitted her project proposal, atmospheric energy harvester. Utter nonsense. She probably copied it from some science fiction movie. Mrs. Gable had just shrugged, more interested in her crossword puzzle. No one ever challenged Charles Dunning. His cynicism was as much a part of the school's culture as the peeling paint and the outdated textbooks. After he had successfully ejected Imani from the fair, he returned to the lounge, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. Had to disqualify a student, he announced to the room. Another one trying to cheat the system. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and smirked. She'll learn her place. His ego, wounded so badly all those years ago, had found its healing balm in cruelty. He wasn't just a biased teacher anymore. He was vengeful. Kicking Imani out of the science fair wasn't about academic integrity. It was about putting a brilliant young student back in the box he had built for her. A box that would keep her small and by extension keep him feeling big. The school day ended, but the events of the afternoon hung heavy in the air. Liam Brooks didn't go home. He went to the AV club room. A small, cluttered space filled with old cameras, editing equipment, and the constant hum of computers. He pulled his tablet from his backpack, his hands moving with purpose. He had been setting up a live stream for the science fair, a low-budget production for the school's website. He had positioned a small, discreet camera on a tripod overlooking the main floor. It had captured everything. The wide shot of the gym, Imani at her table, Dunning's aggressive approach, the public shaming. The audio was clear. Every contemptuous word Dunning had spoken was perfectly preserved. He isolated the clip, a 3-minute recording of pure injustice. Then he went to find Imani. He knew she often took the late bus. He found her sitting on a bench outside the school, alone, the case containing her project resting beside her. She wasn't crying. She was just staring into the distance, her expression shuttered and unreadable. Liam hesitated. He wasn't good at this, at talking to people, especially about difficult things. He took a deep breath and walked over. "Hey," he said softly. Imani looked up, her eyes showing a flicker of surprise. She recognized him from her chemistry class. "I saw what happened," Liam continued, his voice earnest. "In the gym. And I heard what he said outside the principal's office. It wasn't right." Imani just nodded, offering a small, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was used to sympathy that went nowhere. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said. Then he took the plunge. "Look, I was running the stream for the fair. I have a video of the whole thing." He held out his tablet. Her eyes widened as he pressed play. She watched the scene unfold from a distance, like an out-of-body experience. She saw herself small and isolated at her table. She saw Dunning loom over her, his face twisted in a sneer. She heard his loud, accusing voice echo through the gym. She saw the other students stare. Watching it, she felt a cold anger replace the hot sting of humiliation. It was one thing to experience it. It was another to see it laid bare as a piece of undeniable evidence. When the clip ended, she looked at Liam, a question in her eyes. "You don't have to fight this alone," he said, his voice gaining confidence. "This isn't just his word against yours anymore. This is proof." He took another breath, his mind racing. We could do something with this. We could upload it. Anonymously. Send it to the local news, maybe a blog." He then had another idea, a bigger one. He remembered the name on the papers she had submitted with her project. NASA. He quickly typed into his tablet's search bar. "Wait a minute. That STEM challenge you mentioned in your project proposal. The NASA one." Imani's heart skipped a beat. She nodded slowly. Liam's fingers flew across the screen, pulling up the submission portal she had seen months ago. It was still active. "We don't just have to go local," he said, a thrill of rebellion in his voice. "You said they were interested before, right? What if they saw this? What if they saw what happened to a student they had already flagged as promising?" He looked at her, his eyes shining with a fierce sense of purpose. "We can send them the video. And we can send them your full specs. Your research. Everything. Right now. Using a burner email. No names. Just the data and the proof of what they did to you." Imani hesitated. This was the exact thing she had avoided. The spotlight. The attention. But things were different now. Mr. Dunning hadn't just insulted her work. He had insulted her father's memory. He had tried to erase her. The quiet path hadn't worked. It had only left her vulnerable. She looked from the tablet screen, with its damning video, to Liam's expectant face. He was a stranger, really. But in that moment he was the only person who had offered her a hand instead of a judgment. She took a slow, deep breath and gave him a firm, decisive nod. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Let's not just go big. Let's go bigger." The quiet alliance was forged. In the small, anonymous world of the AV clubroom, a boy with a tablet and a girl with a revolutionary invention began to plant the seeds of a storm. The system that had tried to crush her was about to feel a tremor. The next day, Mr. Dunning was in his element, holding court in the faculty room. He leaned back in his worn armchair, a smug grin plastered on his face as he recounted his version of events from the science fair. He was the hero of his own story, the vigilant guardian of academic standards. "You should have seen her face," he said with a chuckle, taking a loud sip of his coffee. "Completely stunned. I stopped a fraud in her tracks. It's a good thing I was paying attention." A few of the other teachers nodded along, offering murmurs of support. It was easier to agree with Dunning than to challenge him. But Mr. Jensen, a younger physics teacher, looked skeptical. "I saw her proposal, Charles," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Wasn't that project kind of advanced?" The theory seemed plausible if ambitious. Dunning waved a dismissive hand, his good mood unruffled by the question. "Advanced, please. She probably stole the design off YouTube. There are a million videos like that. Kids watch a 10-minute clip and suddenly think they're Nikola Tesla." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a delicious secret. "I bet her mom helped her build it," he said, a cruel twinkle in his eye. "Maybe she's a cleaning lady with access to military tech." A few of the teachers laughed at that. It was a weak, uncomfortable sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. They were complicit in his mockery, participants in the casual dismantling of a student's reputation. Satisfied that he had cemented his authority, Dunning finished his coffee, stood up, and headed back to his classroom. He had one final act of humiliation to perform. With a piece of tape, he proudly posted Imani's official disqualification notice on the classroom wall, right next to the periodic table, for all her classmates to see. The notice was stark and official, declaring her project ineligible due to a violation of academic integrity standards. He stood back to admire his handiwork, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. She would be a lesson to anyone else who got too ambitious. At that exact moment, the school's front office was dealing with a very different reality. The school secretary, a middle-aged woman named Brenda who had seen it all, was answering the phones, sorting mail, and dealing with a student who had forgotten their lunch money. The phone rang again, its shrill tone cutting through the morning bustle. "Northwood High, this is Brenda speaking," she said in her usual sing-song voice. There was a pause on the other end, and then a woman's voice, calm and clear and imbued with an authority that made Brenda sit up a little straighter. The voice was unlike the usual calls from worried parents or vendors. It was crisp and professional. "Good morning. I'm trying to reach a student at your school. Her name is Imani Carter." Brenda's pen stopped mid-doodle. It wasn't often someone called to speak to a student directly, unless it was an emergency. "May I ask who is calling?" she asked, her voice now more formal. There was another brief pause, and the woman on the other end of the line delivered a sentence that would alter the course of the entire day. "Yes, my name is Dr. Nadia King. I'm calling from NASA." Miles away, in a sleek, modern office, with views of the Virginia coastline, Dr. Nadia King stared at her monitor. The video Liam had uploaded was playing on a loop. It was grainy, shot from a distance, but the audio was sharp, and the injustice was crystal clear. Her face, usually composed and thoughtful, was a mask of disbelief that was slowly hardening into a cold, focused anger. Dr. King was the director of Youth Innovation Outreach for NASA. She was a brilliant astrophysicist who had transitioned into a role she was deeply passionate about, finding the next generation of scientists and engineers in places no one else thought to look. Her division was responsible for the very STEM challenge Imani had submitted her concept 2 months ago. She remembered the paper. It had stood out from the thousands of submissions they received. It wasn't just the idea itself, harvesting atmospheric energy, which was bold and innovative. It was the math. The calculations were elegant. The reasoning sound. It was the work of a mind with a rare intuitive grasp of theoretical physics. Her team had flagged it, tried to make contact, but the student had never replied. They had assumed the email was defunct, or a student had lost interest. Now, watching this video, she understood. The girl in the video, standing silently as a pompous teacher belittled her, was the owner of that brilliant mind. The device he called a toy was the prototype her team had been hoping to see. This is real," Dr. King whispered to the empty room. Her mind moved quickly, piecing it all together. The student's silence, the teacher's aggressive dismissal, the undercurrent of something ugly and prejudicial. She minimized the video and pulled up the anonymous email that had accompanied it. It contained Imani's full research notes, detailed schematics and test data. Dr. King spent 10 minutes scanning the documents, her eyes widening with each page. The work was even more impressive than the initial concept paper had suggested. It was rigorous, meticulous, and groundbreaking. This wasn't a high school project. It was the blueprint for a disruptive technology, and a teacher had called it fake science and thrown it out of a school gym. Her decision was instant and absolute. She picked up her desk phone, her movements precise and deliberate. She didn't call the principal. She didn't call the school district superintendent. She called the school's main line directly. She wanted to start at the source. When the secretary answered, Dr. King stated her purpose with unshakable calm. "I'm looking for Imani Carter. This is Nadia King from NASA." The secretary, Brenda, nearly dropped the phone. NASA. It was a word that didn't belong in her daily vocabulary of attendance records and tardy slips. She stammered, Yes, ma'am. One moment." Doc King could hear the muffled sound of Brenda putting the phone down and shouting for the principal. But Dr. King had no intention of being shuffled up the chain of command just yet. When the secretary came back on the line, flustered, Dr. King took control of the conversation. "Please inform Principal Thompson that I require a formal meeting with Imani Carter at your school this Friday," she said, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "We would like to see a full demonstration of her project, the atmospheric energy harvest." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then she added the final critical instruction. "And please be sure to tell Mr. Charles Dunning that I expect him to be in attendance as well. I have some questions for him regarding his assessment of Miss Carter's work." The message was delivered. A shockwave had been sent from one of the most powerful scientific organizations in the world directly into the heart of Northwood High. The school board would be notified within the hour. The gears of a system much larger and more powerful than Miss Dunning could ever imagine were beginning to turn. Imani walked through the crowded school hallways the next day, as if she were moving through water. The world around her seemed distant and muffled. Whispers followed her like a shadow. Students who had never given her a second glance now stared openly, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. Someone had torn down the disqualification notice from the classroom wall, but the damage was done. The story had spread. Imani Carter, the cheat. As she turned a corner, a girl from her history class, one of the same girls who had laughed in the gym, deliberately bumped her shoulder hard, sending Imani's books tumbling to the floor. "Watch where you're going," the girl sneered, before walking off with her friends, laughing. Imani knelt down, her face impassive, and began to gather her scattered books. She didn't look up. She didn't say a word. She just kept her head down, focusing on the simple task, her personal mantra for survival. She didn't know that a revolution was starting in her name. She didn't know that her quiet act of defiance, sending that email with Liam, had lit a fuse. Meanwhile, in the bustling school library, Liam sat at a computer, pretending to do research for a paper. In reality, he was refreshing his browser, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had set up a Google alert for the terms NASA, high school invention, and Northwood High. For hours, there had been nothing. And then it happened. The first alert pinged. It was a small tech blog, one known for covering STEM education news. The headline was simple: NASA investigating high school students' controversial invention. Liam clicked the link, his hands shaking slightly. The article was short, citing an anonymous source about a remarkable energy device and a brewing controversy at a public high school. It didn't have many details, but it was a start. Then another alert pinged. This time it was the website for a local news station. The headline was more direct: "Local high school students' science project gets NASA's attention after disqualification." The story mentioned an anonymous video and confirmed that NASA had officially contacted the school. A grin spread across Liam's face, a wide, triumphant smile. It was working. It was actually working. He glanced across the library and saw Imani at a table in the corner, reading a textbook, completely oblivious. She was still living in the quiet before the earthquake, enduring the aftershocks of her public humiliation. She had no idea that the world outside the walls of Northwood High was beginning to wake up and take notice. She didn't know that the very people who had mocked her were about to be silent, and she certainly didn't know that the man who had tried to erase her was about to have his entire world crushed by the weight of his own arrogance. The story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the internet now, and it was spreading, a digital wildfire that was about to consume the man who started it. The official letter arrived the following morning by courier. It was not addressed to Principal Thompson, but to the superintendent of the entire school district, with copies sent to every member of the school board and to Northwood High itself. The envelope was thick and bore the iconic blue and red logo of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Inside, the letter was brief, professional, and utterly uncompromising. It formally requested the use of the school auditorium on Friday morning for a live demonstration of a project developed by student Imani Carter. It went on to state that a delegation from NASA, led by Nadia King, Director of Innovation Outreach, would be present to observe and validate the technology. The letter respectfully invited the superintendent, the school board, and members of the local media to attend. The final paragraph was the one that made Principal Thompson's blood run cold. It stated that Mr. Charles Dunning, as the student's primary science instructor, was requested to be present on stage to facilitate the technical setup and answer any questions from the NASA delegation regarding his initial assessment of the project. Miss Dunning was summoned to the principal's office. He walked in with a confident swagger, still convinced this was all some grand bureaucratic mistake. He had heard the rumors of the phone call from NASA, but he had dismissed them as a prank or a misunderstanding. "You wanted to see me, Richard?" he asked, taking a seat without being invited. Principal Thompson slid the letter across the desk. Dunning picked it up, a smirk playing on his lips. He read the first paragraph, his smirk widening. "A live demonstration. They want to see the toy in action. This is fantastic. They'll see for themselves what a fraud it is. I'll be vindicated." He continued to read, his amusement growing. The media, the school board. It was becoming a bigger stage for his triumph than he could have imagined. He would be the hero who exposed the cheater in front of everyone. But then he got to the final lines. He saw the name printed in elegant, authoritative type at the bottom of the page, above her title. Dr. Nadia King, NASA Director of Innovation. The smirk on his face didn't just fade. It collapsed. The color drained from his cheek. His expression hardened into a mask of sudden, sickening realization. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a prank. A director from NASA was coming here. A director had signed this letter. A director was specifically asking for him. A cold dread, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, began to creep up his spine. Fear. He thought back to his casual dismissals, his public mockery, his poisonous whisper outside the principal's office. He had assumed his words existed in a vacuum, a closed system where he was the ultimate authority. He had never imagined that his actions would be reviewed by an authority so far beyond his comprehension, an authority that didn't care about his tenure or his ego, an authority that only cared about the science. He looked up from the letter, his eyes wide, his bravado gone, replaced by the dawning horror of a man who has just realized he has made a catastrophic error in judgment. The hunter was about to become the prey. Friday morning arrived, and the Northwood High Gymnasium was transformed. It was no longer a simple school gym, it was an event space. News vans with satellite dishes on their roofs were parked in a line outside. Reporters with microphones and notepads conversed in hushed, excited tones. Inside, the stands, usually reserved for screaming basketball fans, were filled with a strange mix of people. The entire student body had been filed in, their faces a sea of confusion and anticipation. The school board members sat in the front row, their expressions grim and anxious. The superintendent was there, looking deeply uncomfortable. And scattered throughout the crowd were the unmistakable figures of local journalists, cameras at the ready. On the floor of the gym, a single table was set up with a microphone, much like at the science fair just days before. But this time, it was the center of everyone's universe. Mr. Dunning paced back and forth near the stage, a man visibly coming undone. He repeatedly adjusted his tie, which felt as if it were strangling him. He smoothed his hair, wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers, and stared at the entrance, his face a pale, sickly gray. Then the double doors swung open, and a hush fell over the crowd. Dr. Nadia King entered, flanked by two serious-looking aides. She was not tall, but her presence was immense. She wore a simple, tailored navy blue suit, and she moved with an unhurried, powerful grace that commanded the attention of the entire room. She surveyed the scene, her sharp, intelligent eyes taking in the nervous administrators, the curious students, and the predatory journalists. Her gaze finally landed on Mr. Dunning, and she held it for a moment, her expression unreadable. Principal Thompson scurried over to greet her, his hand outstretched, a weak, welcoming smile on his face. "Dr. King, on behalf of Northwood High." King gave him a polite but brief nod, effectively cutting him off. Her focus was elsewhere. "Where is Imani Carter?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying easily through the quiet gym. Imani was led forward by a school counselor. She looked small in the vast space, but she walked with a newfound straightness to her shoulders. She clutched the case containing her invention. Dr. King's expression softened as she looked at Imani. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I'd like to speak with Miss Carter privately for a moment before we begin," she announced. She gestured toward a small waiting area behind the stage. As Imani started to walk with her, Mr. Dunning saw his chance, his only chance, to try and regain some measure of control. He stepped forward, forcing a pathetic, ingratiating smile. "Dr. King, perhaps I should join you," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "As her teacher, I can provide some context." Dr. King stopped. She turned her head slowly and looked at him. It was not a glance. It was a focused, piercing look that seemed to strip away all his pretense. Her voice was flat, cold, and utterly dismissive. "I wasn't speaking to you." The words, spoken without anger but with the chilling finality of a closing door, hit him like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the rows of students, who were close enough to hear. He froze, his mouth half open, his hand still slightly outstretched. He looked like a statue of a defeated man. He backed away, his face burning with a humiliation 1,000 times more potent than the one he had inflicted on Imani. He was no longer the authority figure. He was an irrelevant, embarrassing footnote. And the main event hadn't even begun. Dr. King and Imani emerged from their brief meeting a few minutes later. A change had come over the young girl. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She walked onto the stage, placed her device on the table, and looked out at the packed gymnasium, her gaze sweeping over her fellow students, the anxious administrators, and finally, settling for a moment on the pale, sweating face of Mr. Dunning. The same device that had gotten her humiliated was now the center of attention, under the bright lights, with cameras broadcasting its every detail. With practiced, deliberate movements, Imani began the demonstration. She opened her notebook, showing the schematics to a camera that projected the image onto a large screen behind her. She then connected a few wires from her device to a large, sensitive voltmeter. Its display also mirrored on the screen for everyone to see. The needle on the voltmeter was at 0. Then, with a flick of a switch on her atmospheric energy harvester, she activated it. For a moment, nothing happened. The gym was silent, holding its collective breath. Then, slowly at first, the needle on the voltmeter began to climb. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. It went past 1 volt, then 2, then 5. The numbers ticked upward, steady and undeniable. Imani then took a simple wire leading from her device and connected it to a standard 60-watt light bulb. The bulb flickered once, then glowed to life, casting a warm, steady light across the stage. A wave of audible gasps swept through the auditorium. It was real. This small, unassuming black box was pulling usable electricity right out of the thin air. The students who had laughed were now sitting in stunned silence, their mouths agape. The teachers who had enabled Dunning's mockery looked down at their feet, their faces flushed with shame. Dr. King stepped up to the microphone, her voice resonating with clarity and authority. "What you are seeing," she began, gesturing to the glowing bulb, "is the conversion of ambient atmospheric electricity into a stable, usable power source. This technology, developed over 3 years by Miss Imani Carter, is not a toy. It is, in our assessment, a groundbreaking achievement." She turned her gaze to the reporters. "The potential applications are immense. This could power remote scientific outposts on Earth, or even on Mars. It could provide clean, cheap electricity to the billions of people living in remote villages without access to a power grid. What Miss Carter has accomplished here is, simply put, revolutionary." Mr. Dunning, standing off to the side, looked as if he might be sick. His world was crumbling in real time. On live television, this was his nightmare. He saw a news camera pan to his face, and in a desperate, last-ditch effort to save himself, he lunged toward the microphone. "Wait," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "The data, her methodology is flawed. It's not possible to generate that much power. It defies the second law of thermodynamics." Dr. King turned to him, her expression one of utter disdain. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were her weapon. "Miss Dunning," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerously quiet register that was nonetheless picked up by the microphone. "With all due respect, you taught introductory biology from a 20-year-old text. You are not qualified to comment on the thermodynamics of a technology you clearly do not understand." The statement was a public execution. A roar of reaction erupted from the student section, a mixture of shock, laughter, and applause. The man who had built his identity on being the smartest person in the room had just been told in front of the entire world that he didn't even have the credentials to be in the conversation. His authority was not just challenged, it was annihilated. The wave of applause for Dr. King's shutdown of Dunning was still echoing through the gym when she raised a hand for silence. The room fell quiet instantly. She turned her attention back to Imani, a look of profound respect on her face. Then she faced the crowd and the cameras again. Because of the extraordinary nature of her work, and because of her resilience in the face of discouraging and unprofessional conduct, King announced, her eyes sweeping over the school board members in the front row. NASA is proud to offer Imani Carter our full developmental support to bring this technology to the next level. This includes a full-ride 4-year scholarship to the university of her choice, valued at $150,000. A new wave of gasps and excited murmurs broke out. $150,000. It was a life-changing number. Imani's eyes welled with tears, but this time, they were tears of vindication. She looked out at her mother, who was standing near the back, her face a beautiful picture of shock and overwhelming pride. Dr. King wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, her voice hardening slightly, as she once again looked toward the school administrators. NASA will be formally recommending that the State Board of Education conduct a full review of this institution's staff and their adherence to policies regarding student welfare, academic encouragement, and anti-discrimination. Innovation cannot thrive in an environment of prejudice. It was a direct threat. The superintendent sank lower in his seat. This was now a full-blown crisis. Mr. Dunning, seeing his entire career, his entire life, slipping away, made one final desperate move. He grabbed the microphone from its stand. "This is a misunderstanding," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I was only trying to uphold standards. I support all my students. She never showed me this data." But before he could continue his pathetic defense, another voice cut through the air, clear and strong. It was Imani. She had stepped forward, her tears now gone, her eyes blazing with a fire no one in that school had ever seen before. She took the microphone from Dr. King's hand. "No," she said, her voice steady and ringing with newfound power. "You didn't support me. You tried to erase me. You called my work a joke. You called me a cheater in front of my peers. You told me to stick to what my people are good at." She paused, letting the weight of her words land. "But I don't need your approval. I never did. My work speaks for itself." The silence that followed was broken by a single person in the student section, who began to clap. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire student body was on its feet, a thunderous, roaring standing ovation, filling the gymnasium. It was a sound of rebellion, of solidarity, of justice. They weren't just clapping for Imani's invention, or her scholarship. They were clapping because they had just witnessed a bully get taken down. They were clapping for the quiet girl who had finally found her voice, and used it to speak an undeniable truth. Mr. Dunning stood frozen, exposed and utterly defeated. The sound of the applause was a physical assault. 2 security guards, dispatched by the nervous superintendent, walked onto the stage and stood on either side of him. They didn't touch him, but their presence was a clear signal. It was over. Wordlessly, he turned and allowed himself to be escorted off the stage, through a side door away from the thunderous applause and the bright lights of his own public downfall. The fallout was swift and brutal. The school board convened an emergency meeting that very afternoon. The video Liam had taken, along with Dr. King's public testimony and Imani's powerful statement, left them no choice. The vote was unanimous. Charles Dunning was fired, effective immediately, for gross misconduct and a clear violation of the district's ethics policies. As he exited the school building for the last time carrying a cardboard box with the sad remnants of his 2-decade career, a local news camera caught him. The footage was merciless. It showed a man shrunken, his face pale and drawn, his usual arrogance replaced by the hollow-eyed look of utter defeat. He shielded his face and scurried to his car like a creature of the dark exposed to sunlight. That image would be the final pathetic photograph of his professional life. But the consequences didn't stop there. The news of his racially charged comments, now public, triggered a deeper investigation into his past. Other former students began to come forward with their own stories of his biased grading and verbal abuse. An anonymous tip line was flooded. The school district, facing a massive lawsuit and a public relations nightmare, froze his pension and severance pay pending the outcome of the investigation into his past misconduct. His bank accounts were temporarily frozen, his assets locked down. The man who had tried to deny a young girl her future found his own past, present and future crumbling to dust in a matter of hours. The winds of fortune, however, blew in a very different direction for Liam Brooks. Dr. King, having been quietly informed of his role in bringing the situation to light, had one of her aides pull him aside after the demonstration. She was impressed by his courage and his principled stand. On the spot, He was offered a paid summer internship with NASA's Media and Communications Department. For the boy who had always lived behind the camera, it was a dream come true. He had used his skills not just to observe, but to change the world, and now he was being rewarded for it. Back in the hallways of Northwood High, the social order had been turned upside down. The students who had laughed at Imani, the ones who had whispered and pointed, were now speechless. They looked at each other with a mixture of shock and dawning shame. The girl they had dismissed as a cheater and an outcast was now a hero, a scholarship winner, a nationally recognized genius. They had been on the wrong side of history, and the quiet awkwardness in the classrooms and cafeteria was their silent punishment. The story of Imani Carter, the teenage inventor from Northwood High, exploded across the country. It was the perfect narrative, a story of an underdog, of injustice, of brilliance, and of ultimate triumph. She became an overnight sensation. Her face was on the cover of magazines, and her name trended on social media for weeks. Hashtags like "DS Believe Black Genius" and "Imani's the Inventor" became global rallying cries for underestimated youth everywhere. The invitations started pouring in. She was flown to Washington, D.C., where she was given a private tour of the Goddard Space Flight Center. She met with some of the world's top scientists, men and women who didn't look at her with skepticism, but with awe. They treated her not as a child, but as a colleague. They peppered her with questions about her research, their excitement, genuine and infectious. She appeared on national morning talk shows, sitting confidently across from hosts who treated her like a rock star. She was no longer the quiet, introverted girl from the back of the class. The fire that had been lit inside her during that final confrontation with Dunning now burned brightly for all the world to see. She spoke with eloquence and passion about the importance of curiosity, of believing in oneself, and of never letting anyone else define your limit. Through it all, her mother was by her side, a quiet, steady presence. One evening, after a long day of interviews and meetings in their hotel room in D.C., Imani looked out the window at the glittering lights of the capital city. It all felt so surreal, so far from her small workshop in the garage. Her mother came up behind her and put her arms around her. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Imani hugged her tight, a wave of emotion washing over her. "I did it, Mum," she said, her voice thick with feeling. Then she looked up, past the city lights, toward the dark, star-filled sky. She thought of her father, the man who had first sparked her love for the unseen energies of the world. In the quiet of her heart, she whispered a message just for him. "I did it, Dad." Her journey was just beginning. The scholarship was waiting, the university of her dreams was within reach, and a future brighter than any light bulb she could power lay ahead. She was no longer just Imani Carter. She was Imani the Inventor, a teen titan whose story was already inspiring millions. Sometimes the janitor is a secret billionaire, waiting for the right moment to reveal his true worth. Sometimes the waitress who serves you coffee owns the entire building, watching and learning from the ground up. And sometimes the quiet black girl in the back of the classroom, the one they ignore, mock, and try to humiliate, is the very one who is rewriting the future. The world is full of hidden giants, people whose brilliance is masked by unassuming exteriors and the low expectations of others. They are the ones who don't seek the spotlight, but who work tirelessly in the quiet spaces, driven not by a need for applause, but by a deep and abiding passion for their craft. They build, they create, they solve the puzzles that others don't even see. But when their moment comes, when circumstance forces their hand, their quiet power is revealed, and it can shake the very foundations of the world for those who underestimated them. The story of Imani Carter is a reminder that talent doesn't have a dress code, genius doesn't have a zip code, and brilliance doesn't have a single approved skin color. It can be found anywhere, in anyone. The mistake is not in discovering it in an unexpected place, but in creating a world so full of prejudice and ego that you fail to see it when it's standing right in front of you, holding a revolutionary invention in its hand. The system that tried to crush Imani was built on the fragile ego of one bitter man, and supported by the silent complicity of those who found it easier to laugh along than to stand up. But all it took was one person with a camera, and one woman with the authority to see the truth, to bring that entire system crashing down. Imani's journey shows us that the loudest voice in the room is not always the most powerful. True power is not in the ability to shout others down, but in the quiet confidence of knowing your own worth, even when no one else does. It is in the resilience to keep building, even after they have thrown you out of the fair. It is in finding your voice, not to shout but to speak the truth with a clarity that can no longer be ignored. A single quote from Imani given during a television interview began to appear on posters and social media feeds around the world. A simple and powerful mantra for a new generation of dreamers. It read, "Never let someone with no vision try to cancel yours." If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.